Well, hello everyone. This is Trevor Horwitz speaking. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar this afternoon, How to Survive the Top 10 Cybersecurity Risks of 2016. We've got an hour to go in our webinar, so without further ado, let's get it going. Firstly, just a note about InfraGard and a little disclaimer. The opinions and views and content of this webinar are solely those of the speakers and contributors and not the views necessarily of InfraGard or the InfraGard Atlanta Members Alliance. So with that having said, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Paul Farley. Paul, won't you give a quick bio and introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, welcome everybody. We're excited to present this webinar on behalf of InfraGard Atlanta. And thank you, Trevor, for facilitating this. And thank you to our sponsor, which I'm sure we'll thank at some point. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. I'm a past president of the Atlanta InfraGard chapter. I've been involved in InfraGard for a number of years and have seen a lot of value there. I've been in the information security field for between 15 or 20 years, depending on what you count. I'm currently responsible for information security at a company called Variant Systems in Alpharetta, and global organization, about $1 billion in revenue. So pleased to talk about some of these topics today. They're very topical for me.
Thanks, Paul. Our next panelist is Javad Malik, and he's joining us from London in the UK. Javad, why don't you give a quick hello to our audience?
Thank you very much for that. So thank you everyone for attending. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I've been working in information security my entire career. My first job was in IT security. I spent the first decade or so as a practitioner, working mainly in the financial sector. Then my calling came as an industry analyst, so I went off there and became an analyst for a while. And to complete my descent into madness, I'm now working for a vendor, AlienVault. So, I work as their security advocate. So part of my role is to do community outreach and education and talk about security without having the headaches of actually doing it myself.
Thanks, Javad. And if anyone is having trouble understanding Javad, they can just send us a message and I'll translate that into English. So without further ado, I also want to introduce myself. My name is Trevor Horwitz. I'm the founder and CISO of TrustNet. We're a specialized cybersecurity and compliance company based here in Atlanta. I'm also on the board of InfraGard Atlanta. And I think I've been running these webinars. We've had quite a successful shot at these webinars over the last several months. So that's sort of my outreach part of the work that I do. If anyone wants to connect with any of the panelists, we've put our Twitter handles and LinkedIn connections also in the presentation, so feel free to reach out to us at any time. I also want to thank our sponsors. TrustNet, my company, actually, we're one of the sponsors of the webinar. And just a little shout out for TrustNet. We help businesses build trusted relationships with their customers through cybersecurity and compliance services and solutions. We're also a managed security services provider at PCI QSA. My other sponsor today is AlienVault. AlienVault, as many of you know, is one of the major players in the space for an integrated threat detection, and it's an all-in-one solution. So please, support our sponsors. They help us bring this content and this webinar to you, at no cost. So without further ado, let's get to our top 10 cybersecurity risks of 2016. So between the panelists and some other industry experts, we've come up with the following list. And the presentation will take place shortly, and we'll be running through each one of these things. So we've got some usual suspects there, some things that I think a lot of the folks will be familiar with, and maybe some things that are a little bit surprising to some folks as well, in terms of what we consider to be the top 10. So we're happy to battle it out and sort of justify why we think these are the top 10. during the presentation. A couple of other housekeeping notes. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of the presentation after we finish our last topic. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and send them to us. Send the questions to the presenters. We'd love to address those questions and sort of help everyone educate themselves a little bit better. In addition to that, we'll also be running polls during the webinar. There are 3 different polls, and please help us participate in that. It's really valuable information when we find folks are participating and have something to add to the conversation as well. And of course, the first question that everyone asks is, will the presentation be available after the webinar? And the answer, of course, is yes. There's a recording available, and we'll be sending out the link to the recording as soon as it gets processed after the webinar. And feel free to share that with your colleagues, friends, children, etc. All right, so our first topic we're going to talk about is malware. I'm going to ask Javad to talk on this. Javad, we've seen the crypto virus in particular this past year has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And malware and viruses have been around for a long time. What's going on here? Why is this still an issue?
Well, malware is a really broad term, and what we see is it just continually evolves and changes, and so where we end up catching a lot of old stuff, or it just becomes obsolete. I mean, there's still companies out there that say, hey, we still got Configure or Red Alert or something bouncing around our systems every now and then, and it's benign, but it's kind of like still out there. So completely shutting down malware is a really, really tough thing, and especially now we've seen the avenues kind of like change. I think on one hand we see more a rise in mobile related malware, so especially in the Android store or App Store, you can go download stuff and it's got all kinds of nasty stuff on there. But there's also the increase of these ransomware type things. So like it'll go out, encrypt all your files, and say, now pay up or lose your data forever. And this is particularly really challenging because it's crypto's crypto. There's no backdoor as much as some people would love for there to be some. The bad guys aren't going to use compromised crypto. So recovering from that is very difficult. And I think two of the real key issues here, I think that companies can do to try and protect themselves going forward is first off, have backups of all your critical stuff, because if your files get encrypted, there's no way you're going to really get it back unless you pay them, and even then there's no guarantee. So have backups of all your critical stuff there, so you can wipe the slate clean and go through and recover your data. And the other thing is user awareness, which will probably be an underlying theme for many of these points. But if a user doesn't fall victim to a phishing email or something, doesn't click on stuff that they shouldn't do, doesn't download stuff they shouldn't, connect to stuff that they shouldn't, that will greatly reduce the likelihood of malware getting in or infecting your systems. But it's still continually there, and I mean, as much of an optimist as I am, I don't see it declining during 2016, unfortunately.
Yeah, one of the things I've found really interesting when it comes to the crypto virus and ransomware is how sophisticated the pricing model is. The pricing model is a critical part of that because it's got to the point where the hackers have worked out what is the economic price that will allow them to maximize the return on the investment. In other words, if they, for example, had made the ransomware, $10,000 each time you got hit, there's a very small percentage of people that would actually pay that. So it's kind of interesting to me how economics plays into the whole extraction and extortion game and how important that is.
It's interesting you bring that up because that was the point I was going to make. Is there's an entire that ecosystem to actually get value out of them distributing that is much more lightweight than going after something like credit cards. because of the inherent ties to banks. So I don't think we've seen the last of this. As well, we're seeing more and more where the exploits aren't exploits of vulnerabilities. They're just native functions that are available on the systems, and people are executing them. Why break the system if someone will execute them? So it's the time-old story of education and combined with technical measures to try and head this off.
Yeah, that's a great point. While we're on that topic, we've put up a poll and asked the audience to go ahead and start voting, so we can get some poll numbers in while we continue with the presentation. So the next item we're going to talk about here is talking about the insider threat. So a couple of comments on this, which I think is sort of important for our audience. One of the things that woke me up to the insider threat was an incident back in 2008 where the city of San Francisco was held ransom by one of their IT administrators who had essentially locked up the system. I think some of the folks may remember that. The individual was eventually arrested and convicted of felony network tampering, but effectively locked out the city of San Francisco from their systems for an extended period of time. So, in terms of the potential impact factor, the insider threat from IT administrators is probably huge, and that's from people like ourselves, network and security folks. On the other hand, it's extremely rare. So you look at the likelihood, and you can see that that's not a huge issue when it comes to likelihood. But it's always a best practice for folks to remember that they should have a backup plan in case they do have an employee or a trusted employee who goes rogue. And it also applies if that individual is also somehow incapacitated in some way, and to have a backup plan. There's really no reason for one individual to be the king of the castle. Another issue that we come across related to this is we see often that IT security teams are sharing user IDs and passwords for administrative tasks. And that's the type of behavior that we typically would discipline an employee for or even fire them. Sharing user credentials is a fireable offense at a lot of organizations. So it's kind of difficult for us to sort of be preaching that message when we're not eating our own dog food. I saw a great comment from the SANS Institute. They've got a white paper, and it's called Privileged Password Sharing is the Root of All Evil. Now, of course, the poster child for insider threats is Edward Snowden. But one of the things that I wanted to discuss with the audience and share with them is to combat the insider threat. One of the ways to do this is to look at categorizing all of your users, putting them into different buckets. Who are the privileged users? Who are your contractors, employees, either IT and admin users, regular employees? Each one of those has a different threat vector and different vulnerabilities. So that's one of the first things I want to recommend is go ahead and categorize the users. And once you've done that, then start looking at some of the solutions out there to how to combat the threat. And it comes down to, in my mind, three things. Firstly, you've got deterrence, and that means having strong internal policies, doing background checks, lots of training, security awareness, and also, obviously, identity and access management and encryption. The next one is detection, looking at doing monitoring, data loss prevention, hugely important tool. It's probably overlooked in a lot of organizations. And then looking at IDS and IPS capability. One of the things we see as a QSA is that's very poorly executed by a lot of organizations is locking down the data exfiltration points in looking at data that's leaving the environment. That's a consistent weakness in folks not really looking at what egress traffic is going out and what it looks like and what the content is. And the last thing I want to recommend in this area is look at things like forensics analysis. SIM, user behavior, and predictive analytics, those are hugely important in looking at your analytics and forensics. Paul, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, there is. I think two things. This kind of has a little bit of the ick factor, so it's hard for people to wrap their heads around it because, the dialogue often starts with, well, we have great people here at XYZ company. And and in most cases that's true. You do have great people at XYZ company, but there are going to be a couple of categories, as were mentioned. You're going to have some genuine malicious insiders. They just quit and they're taking the price list, or they want to take something down. They have an axe to grind. You have kind of the clueless insider who's just trying to do their job and don't realize that what they're doing is putting the organization at risk. And then you have the credential hijacking, a vector that was just brought to me or brought to my awareness was the prevalence of Outlook Web Access without two-factor, and how easily that's compromised, and how a common threat vector now is people to get just an everyday user, not a privileged user, but to get those credentials via whatever the various means, use Outlook Web Access to sit in their mail and then effectively be inside the company's system and to siphon off enough data to be able to affect other attacks, or to use that as the ability to have a launching off point, whether it's to reset something or to send an email from inside to ask for access or what have you. So I agree that on the solution side of this, we're going to see a lot more behavior analytics, a lot more of trying to put the person with the credential and say, hey, Paul never accesses this server over here. Why is that happening? Maybe, and that might pop up adaptive authentication, right? That says, hey, let's give another factor to make sure that this is truly Paul. And if it is, then let him go. Get out of the way. So when I talk about this internally, I talk a lot about that the security mindset is not necessarily what will somebody do, but what can they do, and that opens people's eyes or helps them understand that we're not talking about our users or dirtbags, which is what some people hear when they hear insider threat.
Yeah, good points. All right, moving on from there into our next topic on cloud security. More and more organizations obviously are moving to the cloud. I mean, that's a fact there, and we see a lot of security concerns in the industry. Some of the things that have been brought up by some of our clients are, looking at account compromise in the cloud, malware in the cloud, how is that impacting them? And the most important issue by far is sensitive data exposure, specifically PCI and HIPAA-related data. So, Javad, is cloud a huge risk? Why is this on our top 10?
I think one of the fundamental challenges with the cloud is the lack of understanding around, and people have been using it for some time now, but there still is that lack of understanding in not only just what is the cloud, it's like, and whether you're talking about, software service, platform, application, whatever that is, but also where the customer's responsibilities lies for protecting the data there in the cloud, and where the cloud provider's responsibilities are. So, take, for example, Amazon has a really well-published shared responsibility model, where they clearly lay out that, look, they're responsible for the compute, the storage, the networking, and what have you, and the customer is actually responsible for the OS, the firewall configuration, the identity and access management, and all that kind of thing. I think a lot of customers who use the cloud have they were either not aware of that, or they were just complacent in that, or they didn't give it the same level of rigor that was needed. So that's put them in a kind of like a vulnerable position. I think the second aspect of it is that there are some threats that are in the cloud that are different from when you're doing something on-prem, and so kind of like, because of how you're accessing it, the risk profile are different. It's open to the public. So even simple things like two-factor authentication, enabling it where it is able, because like if someone could get into your console, that's kind of like pretty much game over. They can actually lock you out and hijack your account. And the other sort of angle is like using your cloud resources for things like Bitcoin mining. It's something that they're not even really interested in your data. They just want access to your cloud resources, and make sure you foot the bill for it. It's something that's very different from your traditional on-prem model. So it's often overlooked in sort of like risk assessments or kind of like evaluations when you're looking at cloud. So I think it's kind of like a combination of factors. I'm trying to resist from saying education or awareness again, but it's kind of like having the right appropriate monitoring. So that's it. Sorry, I forgot. There was another point. Is like from a technical perspective, the way the cloud logs stuff and how it's reported on and what you actually have access to varies from provider to provider and how you're actually using it. So having the right tools in place that can actually, pass those logs and raise alerts like your on-prem SIM would do, for example, specifically for the cloud is key, because without that, you actually lose a lot of visibility of what's happening and how it's happening until it's too late, until your cloud provider actually turns around to you and says, hey, are you sure you wanted to rack up 100 grams worth of bill this month?
Yeah, all good points. Moving on to our next topic on third-party providers. We've seen a lot of growth in reliance on third parties as more and more companies turn to outsourcing to reduce cost, to become more focused, increase collaboration, lots of different reasons for that. Obviously, the target stores are the poster child, unfortunately, for how trusting a third party can lead to being hacked. As many of you know, the Target store's hack occurred through a trusted third party who had access to a back-end system. Now, there was a series of events there, but initially the attack actually initiated through a third party. So what's going on in this area? What do you think's happening, Paul? How do we prevent these things from happening?
So the risk and the challenge is that that this is an area of low control for an organization, and so hence the need for oversight. So some industries, the financial services industry in particular, has been more forward on this, in part because the regulatory environment. But as we've seen over the last 18 months to 2 years. Most of the major breaches have come in some form through a third party or a significant piece of that. And so, the need is there. What we're challenged with as an industry is finding a scalable way to do that. And I would hazard a guess, and if we threw up a survey that said who's getting buried by questionnaires or who's sending out questionnaires and doesn't have the ability to really do anything with it, they're doing the checkbox to show some due diligence. This is really an unsolved problem so far. What I found that works is one, work closely with the legal team and the procurement teams to embed at least some standard language and standard forms, and hopefully most people have that, into your purchasing process, and only have that come to the information security team when there's an exception to that, when there's a red line of that, which is often right now, at least in my case, I'm finding, but still there's a percentage that's not, that goes through. And in doing that, it helps scale the problem. The key is it has to be actionable. You have to come up with a way to triage your vendors. You can't treat everybody the same. So follow the data, follow the access. Don't treat your office supply vendor the same way you treat a business process outsourcer that has full access to your environment. So a lot of this is intuitive, I would suspect, to most of the people on this webinar. But the key is to make it systematic so that you can go through and maintain the system. Because a one hit when you first sign that agreement is valuable, but it's even more valuable to continue to monitor them, depending on the riskiness of them for your organization, whether that's annually, whether that's every 3 years. Everybody has to set that bar, but it really is a critical activity to keep your pulse on what's going on with the people that have access in your environment and are handling your data.
One of the things that we've seen with, again, in a lot of client environments is the third-party providers, they're doing due diligence up front, but you're doing it at a point in time. There's no ongoing assessment to see whether these vendors and these providers are actually adhering to their agreements. So it does become, in a lot of instances, just a checkbox. Okay, they've ticked the PCR compliance box, but that ongoing maintenance and ongoing assessment is just something, like you said, is just ongoing problem, and no real solutions out there to solve that in the near term. So obviously something there for someone to jump on and to start to tackle. Moving on to our next topic, which is BYOD or BYOX, bring your own device, whatever that may be. This seems like there's a sort of massive underserved or under-recognized risk. We've seen with the consumerization of information technology that we now have this massive army of really smart, tech-savvy IT workers coming into the work environment, all wanting to bring their own devices. And there's a lot of good reasons for why bring your own device or bring your own tablet, whatever that may be, why it makes sense from a business perspective. Lower cost, increased productivity. I think a lot of businesses recognize that we're getting much more than 40-hour work week out of employees that are enabled with these tools. But the bigger question, and I'm going to turn to Javad again to answer this one, how do we manage this risk when it comes to bring your own device? Javad, are you there? Oh, it looks like we can't hear you. Paul, do you have any comments on bring your own device?
I do, and hopefully Javad will come back and join us in a minute. Recently had a conversation with some peers on this, and what's interesting is that this is a little bit of an arms race because there's always, and it's going to be brutal for all of us come January when everybody shows up in the office with their brand new devices. And by everybody, I mean, the C-suite mahogany row, when they get their new favorite device that you've never seen before, and they're going to want to, put it on the company network. And so the focus on device is where we are right now. We've seen a lot of maturity in MDM platforms. There's a lot more to go, I think. And as well, a shift from protection, from you've seen the containerization strategies to one of visibility. I think we need to move more to a visibility perspective and looking at the data that's flowing there, and as well focusing on the apps. How do we take known malicious apps off the table? The devices themselves, I'm not aware of a public breach of exploit of a device out there. All the exploits are executed by somebody running an app, clicking a link, so on and so forth. That's rampant. So we really need to focus on the data and on the apps, and shift our focus there. But I think this is still a pretty wide open field. Nobody's got this answered. Some people, there's also privacy implications of, what happens if you wipe the device and it's a personal device. Some companies don't issue corporate devices at all. Some it's a mix. It's a hybrid approach. I'll pause. Javad, are you back?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yes.
He's back online.
Oh, brilliant. I have no idea what happened there. I was talking and it seemed to be working, but I could hear you guys, but you couldn't hear me. So, have you covered the topic, or do I get a few points in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of bring your own device, the volumes just seem to carry on increasing. They don't seem to be slowing down. A lot of companies don't even stop to ask the question whether they should allow it or not. And I think that's where some of the challenges begin, because if you haven't made the conscious decision to allow it, you tend to not have those any controls in place or risk assess it. But I think things like whitelisting, application and device control tools can definitely help. Also, we see like some companies sort of like virtualizing some of their apps, so you tunnel into it and deploying more stronger sort of like authentication controls, so multi-factor authentication and what have you. So it's kind of like I think in the long run it will shift how some of the actual applications and access is architected, but that's kind of like a more long-term sort of way to address the problem. But in the short term, it's still quite a challenge, I think.
Yeah, those are all good points. Next topic we're going to talk about is Windows XP. This is kind of surprising for a lot of people that Windows XP is still a security issue. Now, when you consider, how embedded the operating system has been and how widespread it is, it's common knowledge that most of the ATM banking network in the U.S. Uses Windows XP as the underlying architecture for those systems. And for a lot of environments in the corporate world, XP's long been gone. But where I think this comes into play for us as security professionals is that user base out there. Specifically, if you're dealing with consumer-facing environments where there is this huge install base, which means if you have an application, you have to somehow mitigate those risks based on an operating system which is no longer supported. How do we address that? Javad, you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think WinXP is a great example because it's kind of like the poster child for a lot of legacy systems that still exist out there. It's not just, we're obviously talking about Windows XP because I think that does represent the biggest risk, but there are, literally hundreds of such applications that are out of date, out of support, that reside within companies. And so I think some of these principles can apply to all of them. I think first and foremost, as a company, you need to take stock of your inventory and identify where all of your Windows XP machines reside. And that's one of those questions that's normally met with the same response as when you ask to see an up-to-date network diagram. It's like, oh yeah, we kind of know what it is, and you start digging into it and you realize there's 50 other systems that crop up that no one really knew about. So it's important to have a migration strategy because it's out of support, and it's like a sitting duck right there. And that's the same with, I'd say that's the same with all of your legacy out of support systems. So have a migration strategy. And based on that, depending on how long it will take you to migrate away, then you can put in place controls or think to invest in controls to help you sort of like mitigate some of those risks. Kind of like things like, and it comes down to the basic stuff that everyone on this call I'm sure is aware of, like, trying to segregate it, like, some network at the network level, hardening it, disabling services that aren't needed, ports, physical access, and just monitoring it really closely, just to make sure that, you are fully aware of all the activity that takes place on that machine and whether it's actually normal or not. So it's quite an intensive process when you start breaking it down like that to actually secure a out of support sort of OS or application, which sort of like from a financial perspective, it makes a lot more sense to try and migrate out as quickly as possible.
Yeah, Paul, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Get off it now. So I agree, and that there's always going to be people who are reluctant, and I certainly think people still running XP in corners of their environment, and if you can't get it off, then wall it up as best you can, because it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues that's really tough to address is the one I brought up initially is what do you do about your user base out there when you've got these apps that you're trying to deploy and you're going out to a user base that are inherently insecure. I don't know if there's an easy solution out there. One of the audience members just brought up a question, which, are there the same concerns using Windows Server 2003? And I think there are just as many concerns there, and sometimes even more so. We've been in an environment where there are, some of the customers we're working with are still running 2003 and wanting to be PCI compliant. And there's obviously some issues there, needing to get them off that old technology and upgrade it onto operating systems that were fully supported. So I think that the issue is the same as far as Windows 2003. There's embedded systems in XP, and we're facing the same issue.
Yeah, and I was about to say, some of the challenges where XP, you might not even be aware that it's XP under the hood. It's XP provided by a vendor, and you're waiting on a vendor to, let's say it's in a hospital environment, it's a radiology machine, and so it's relatively easy to upgrade somebody's laptop compared to, if you go up to update the radiology machine. So in some cases, the answer to this is you have to lean pretty hard on your vendors and get the business teams to lean hard on the vendors to say, look, we're not willing to have this on the environment anymore. So that may drive some tough conversations with those business teams and those vendors about getting that upgraded.
Yeah, all good points.
That brings up that whole can of worms around embedded devices, and it doesn't necessarily need to be out of support or legacy, but how do you update it and how do you patch it? There's been research done on your internet routers or routers. Sorry, I forgot what I'm speaking on the wrong continent. But around vulnerabilities because of the embedded software within them and how easily they're exploitable.
Yeah, good point. All right, let's move on to our next topic, which is talking about the skills gap. And this is a favorite of so many people. We have some major issues in terms of there essentially being a chronic shortage of skills. What are the type of skills, Paul, that you think are lacking? And is it time for us, in the US at least, is it time for us to panic?
I don't think it's time to panic, but I think it is going to drive some different models of how we think about staffing the security function, how we think about building our teams. I think there's two dynamics here in play. One is there's a generational birth rate issue in the workforce overall across all occupations that we're starting to hit, that's kind of rippling through, and so some of this you're feeling is that, but we also have what people are interested in, and everybody wants to be a pen tester. Nobody wants to go do GRC, and so I'm being a little tongue in cheek there, but sometimes it's a matter of having the right people and the right skill sets. And as we've moved from, I think on the slide, this is how we've done it for the last 20 years. The person buried deep in the data center, and I don't know what that guy does. Just keep throwing Cheetos and leave him alone. From that to being more facing of the business, as this has become much more of a business issue, the skills needed to have one foot in either camp and discuss this on a risk basis, on what's the impact to that business line, to help people understand. I really think it's incumbent on us as professionals, security professionals, to translate that into the business language. And we've been saying that for a long time. Every security conference I've attended since I've been in this career, somebody raises their hand and says, how do I get the executive suite to listen to me? Nobody cares what I have to say. And we're getting that. Boards are asking, people are asking. So we've gotten what we wished for, and now we're finding out that we don't have as many people who can speak that language, who can bridge that gap as we thought. Some strategies for there, obviously, awareness is a force multiplier. So deploying technical sensors in your network is not the only way to spot issues. We've talked in several different slides about how awareness is something that can help. This is the same thing. How do you embed security into business functions? Look at this with application security. That's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to educate developers on how to do secure coding, to think about security topics, not just, can I make this app work? And so we need to do the same thing in other business functions to sensitize people to what are the security issues, how to think like a security person, and that can be a force multiplier when you do that with your legal team, with your business people, so that at least they can start to spot these issues and bring them to you. There is a challenge in deeply technical areas that it's hard to hold on to people because everybody's fighting for these resources, everybody's building a SOC, everybody's building a pen test team, and so we've got to get creative. We've got to move people from different areas of the organization. We need to be open to training people, and part of it is I think we need to accept that people aren't going to stay for 15 years. You're not going to get the ROI of training somebody for 2 and then they stay with you for 10. So we need to turn a little faster. Gerard, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I liked your comments on everyone wants to be a pen tester. Basically, it's everyone wants to play offense, no one wants to play defense. And I guess it makes sense when you consider what the risks are, because you're always on the on defense. You have to be right 100% of the time. Offense, you got to be right, just a fraction of the time to be successful. Let's move on to our next topic, which we're talking about, which is spear phishing. And so we've seen a lot of action going on in spear phishing, and there's been a rapid shift from the sort of scattershot phishing attacks of yesteryear to these very targeted and sophisticated. And spear phishing has resulted in some major hacks, and there's actually a list there: RSA, Target stores, Home Depot. All of these originated from spear phishing attacks. So I think that what is important for some of the folks to understand is the difference between a regular phishing attack and a spear phishing attack is that the spear phishing attack typically has context. So hackers will, go and hack into a particular organization, sometimes mail providers, and suck out all the data related to, say, a bank. Or they'll go troll social media and get some sort of context based on the individual user. And then they'll use that data as an enticement to provide context to an email and then use it as an entry point to entice the user into clicking on a link or going to a website and doing something that they shouldn't. And if you look at the data about how sophisticated or how successful these attacks are, the mass spam emails have an open rate of about 3%, but spear phishing have open rates of about 70%. And then if you look at further, the spam email recipients will click on a link about 5% of the time, and the recipients of spear phishing emails, that ratio is about 50% of the time. So, it's really no wonder that there's so much attention on spear phishing from a hacker's perspective, just because it works. So they're generating, 10 times the revenue on 1,000 emails than they would if they sent out 1 million to, non-targeted audience. So you're seeing some of the things there. So I want to see if, Javad, maybe you have some insights into some of the prevention techniques we could do this?
So, it really depends on the nature of the spear phishing. So sometimes it's in for the long con, and, they'll send an initial icebreaker email with no malicious links or files attached to gain that trust. And after there's been an exchange for a little while, they'll then go in with the payload. And so detecting something like that is very, very difficult from a technical point of view up front. What you can do is look for, if you've got your monitoring in place and if you're doing some form of behavioral analytics or something, you can you can sort of spot once someone's fallen victim and their credentials have been compromised and now they're going about doing all sorts of stuff they shouldn't do. But that's kind of like a post infection. Pre that, it's really, again, I sound like a broken record. Anyone born after 85 will have no idea what that reference means. But it's really about training your users and making them more aware of, like, if they receive an email that, they pick up the phone maybe and ask your CFO, did you actually send me this email asking me to give you my corporate card details? Or even, like, if you receive an unexpected Amazon package delivery coming, which is like, oh, here's your phone charger that you ordered, don't just plug it in, or something like that. So it's all these sorts of things that, it just boils down to awareness and, people, asking them not to be too careless with the information they put out there in public, like social media, like, hey, I'm the CEO of this company and I'm now, going to be spending 2 weeks in Hawaii or something.
Our next topic is talking about shadow IT. So I wanted to get a take from that from you, Javad. I mean, what do you think about shadow IT? We've seen a lot of users out there going about and using cloud services for things like Dropbox, very popular Google Docs, and being very creative and using these tools. I mean, Amazon Web Services also created a slew of opportunities where a lot of line level managers can sort of bypass IT and just start setting up their own little skunk works for getting their jobs done. How big an issue is this, and why is this going to be a massive issue for us in 2016?
So this is a big issue, and this kind of like has it kind of like touches on overlaps with the insider threat thing. What we often see is this is like a insider threat scenario, but with a non-malicious intent. More often than not, we see users are just trying to get their jobs done. And what's really interesting or useful for companies or IT teams to take note is that what users are actually saying is the tools that you provide me, I feel are actually inadequate for a lot of my purposes. So, the document sharing repository you've set up, it absolutely is rubbish. So all of us, we're just going to use Dropbox because it's just far more easier. So I think it's one of the jobs of IT is to actually take this on as feedback and say, well, okay, what tools does the business actually want to use? And just like bring your own whatever. It's no longer the company or the operating sort of environment of the 80s or 90s where the company can dictate this is the software you use, this is the hardware you use, and this is how you're going to use it. It's about understanding and then adapting to that. So I mean, you can put in like application-aware firewalls and other monitoring controls in place to detect what people are doing. But the big caveat there is if people are connected to your network using devices that and going through sort of gateways that you monitor and control. Because if they've just bought their own device and they're accessing it from their home network, then you lose a ton of visibility there.
Okay, moving on to our next one, which is incident response fail. So clearly we know, based on what's happened already to date in 2015, that there is inevitably going to be these major hacks, and a lot of companies going to be impacted. So what are we doing wrong, or what are we not doing? Paul, do you have some insights into this?
I don't, because I'm not vulnerable to an incident. It can't happen to me. So yeah, that's kind of the mindset. It sounds crazy when you say that, right? Everybody looks and goes, "What? What did he just say?" And that's kind of how we think through this. Is we don't fully go through the process, and I think there's a few things that I've seen that we fall down on that I thought would be useful to point out. One, know the plan ahead of time. I mean, this is Captain Obvious statement, but walk through it. Do it even if you don't do a tabletop. Walk through the plan and say, does this make sense? And not just does this make sense to me. The people on this call are pretty sophisticated, from an understanding of this topic. But Joe or Sally out in the organization who isn't very security aware, are they going to understand how to plug into this if they need to and kick this off or get the right attention? See a lot of teams that lack the ability or the tools or the ability to operate the tools they do have throughout the incident response process. So that's okay. Don't beat yourself up about it. There's a lot of companies out there that you can sign $0 contracts with to parachute in with that expertise should you need it while you build that as fits your organization. And the third thing I would say is make sure you understand the stakeholders. This isn't going to just be you. You're going to need legal support. You're going to maybe need public relations support. Who can say take that offline? If that's your production, consumer-facing web property, who in the organization can say yes, pull the plug, or no, we're going to keep it up and try to mitigate it? So the more you can make those decisions ahead of time, the more successful you're going to be. Making them in the heat of battle, you might get lucky, but you have an equal choice of getting punched, and that's no fun.
Yeah, that's really a great comments. So just a quick recap. Here's again our top 10. These were cybersecurity risks. We're going to move into our Q&A section in a minute. Just to go through them again, we discussed malware and how cryptoviruses and similar type of malware has really rocked a lot of our environments. The insider threat, looking at lots of different variants there from privileged users and other types of individuals. We have a more IT-centric workforce today. Cloud security, we covered a bunch of different topics there about really people not really paying attention to risk factors, not doing proper due diligence. I think a lot of companies are sort of throwing out the rules when it comes to cloud security, not going back to best practices. Third-party providers, we touched on a number of issues again there, and I think Paul pointed out that we're doing some check-the-box due diligence and not engaging in legal and procurement teams and making sure that they have the right context for those contracts. Bring your own device. Javad mentioned a bunch of different issues there as well in terms of issues that we need to address. Very much the consumerization of IT has allowed us to have these knowledgeable workers, but it comes at a cost. Windows XP seems like embedded systems there, and just the pervasiveness of XP has been an issue. Skills gap, and that's been a recurring theme for us, I think, for the last 10 years, just needing better resources and educating our workforce. And then we discussed spear phishing and how users are increasingly being targeted, and these mass emails are no longer as much of an issue, but these targeted issues are becoming increasingly more sophisticated and providing context for hackers, which leads them to increase their success rate in hacking. And then we spoke about shadow IT, how software as a service has increased the ability for end users to get out there and have access to tools, bypassing IT, bypassing security protocols, and leading to really a major issue. And lastly, just talking about incident response fail, how we're really not addressing this issue squarely on, and a lot of organizations paying lip service to setting up proper response plan and just thinking, hey, it's not going to happen to me. So with that having said, just a quick shout out to the leadership. This is the Atlanta InfraGuard leadership. I think some of the folks are on the call, and we're going to get into the Q&A section in a minute. I just wanted to give a shout out to my fellow board leadership. We've had a great year. People have worked really hard. We've got a couple of folks who are rolling off the board this year of having served for 2 years. And in particular, also our president, Jeff Gaynor, who's now been elected to the National InfraGuard Board. Just want to thank all you folks. It's been a great year, and this is our last webinar for the year, so I thought I'd take a couple of minutes just to say thank you. Now moving on to the Q&A section, we got a bunch of questions from our users. So I just want to see if we can pose some of those to our team. We've got about 5 minutes left. So the first question I had, and I'll just throw it open, Javad or Paul, feel free to jump in. What's your opinion on cybersecurity threats related to the Internet of Things? Is the Internet of Things something real right now in terms of the security concerns, or is this just a lot of media hype?
I'm tempted to quote Jeff Goldblum's line from Jurassic Park, which is, it was something along the lines of like, the scientists were so worried about whether we could do it, we didn't stop to think whether we should do it. And I think that's kind of like where we are with Internet of Things. People are so excited that they can put a sensor on something and they can make it internet sort of like connectable, that they don't stop to think whether they should. I think for a lot of devices, it probably doesn't matter as such, but there is, a certain percentage that, really, you question why, this has gone through, because the technology is still going through its evolving phase where we haven't really agreed on how it should be secured and how it should be architected, and what do we refer to as a secure IoT device. So until that time, there'll be certain things that will be, quite critical, and it will just be that small slice at the top. I think everything else will be just like, yeah, okay, my Fitbit might have some vulnerabilities, but yeah, I'm not really that bothered.
I see this as another area of almost like consumerization took of, it's going to take off and it's not going to be within the direct control. And so, I just spoke to somebody at another organization who said he discovered some new TVs that they bought that facilities put in for, the display boards we all have that was beaconing out. And his question was, why did we plug those in to start with? And so looking at things like that and saying, you know what, until we understand this, until we have a reason that we should plug them in, there's a time-tested security principle, right? If you don't need it, turn it off, holds true on this as well. And I agree that we don't really understand how this is useful. And so to the extent that we can turn it off and take it off our environments until we really have a reason to deal with it, we're going to be better off.
Okay, another question I have for the panelists. Is there any other risk that was not included in our top 10 that you would include for 2016? Javad?
Internet of Things, I think. So yeah, I think that's kind of like the other thing that, on the wrong device at the wrong place, I think that could be a notable risk. And I think we'll see, because they're so easily accessible, we might see some, more higher impact sort of as a result of internet-enabled devices coming out during the year. So.
Paul, how about you? Any comments on an 11th risk that you would put on the list?
All the ones I can think of fall into one of these 10. Areas really. I think we're going to see an increase in ransomware. That's going to continue to grow. I think we're going to see ransomware on IoT. We're going to see ransomware. If this is successful, right? Why does spam keep happening? Because it works. And I think ransomware falls into that bucket. As security professionals, we constantly have a new tool or a new threat coming over the radar, coming over the horizon rather, and it's easy to get distracted. And I think if we focused, if we really dealt with these 10, we'd be in a pretty great place. So I'm going to stay focused on the 10.
Sounds good. Okay, folks. Well, we're just about up on our time, coming up on 2 p.m. Eastern, and I'd just like to thank again all the attendees for joining us. I think we had a great webinar, and of course our panelists, Javad and Paul. Great job, guys. Really appreciate the effort and work that you went to and trouble you went to get prepared for the webinar. And again, from InfraGuard Atlanta, I just want to thank everyone. for your attendance, and we're continuing our series of webinars into 2016, so look out for that. And thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.